Catfish Symposiums. I was fortunate enough to be the last one in this one, but I missed the first one because I was the new guy at the time. I had just started working in that district fisheries biologist role that I used to have. And Cat, well, I thought it was running.
You don't use the arrow.
There he is.
You'll have to use the arrow up here.
Okay. And so I was just starting to get my feet wet, and I'm a catfisherman. I like catfish, so I have a lot of interest in the management of catfish in the state of Nebraska. And catfish tends to be one of our top 3 species in the state, no matter what metric we use to define that. So they're pretty popular fish, but at the time, I'd have to say management of catfish in Nebraska was stock, spray, and pray. We put a lot of fish out there. We did some work to make sure they were large enough they weren't getting ate, and that was pretty much the end of our catfish management at the time. Not a lot of attention paid to them for quality, size, or anything else, even though they were consistently one of the more popular fish in the state. So I had some interest to try and do some things along those routes. Just so happens my supervisor at the time walked in and sat in the back of the rooms. But I was also the new guy at the time, which basically meant I was young and dumb. And so I thought all about managing catfish was I had an idea, I thought I knew what might help, and I could go out there and make it happen. And I quickly figured out that in order to make anything happen, you have to know and have evidence that it's actually what people want, and there's a reason to do it, because a lot of our management techniques and regimes are kind of grounded in a long time of history and the long-term memories of the people doing the managing. So I volunteered in 2002 to take part and help with the Nebraska Licensed Angler Survey. Anyone that's ever volunteered to help with a statewide survey knows that means you are immediately elected to conduct said survey. And so in 2002, I was part, I'll still say I was only part of, the 2002 Licensed Angler Survey, which targeted catfish anglers on some sections, but collected a lot of just general information about anglers across the state. And then I've continued that tour of duty 2 more times in 2012 and 2018 with surveys that resembled that first one quite a bit, although they weren't targeted specifically with catfish anglers in mind. So I actually have about 20 or 18 years worth of survey data on Nebraska catfish anglers, and thought coming into this meeting it'd be a good time to maybe take a look at that and try and go back and define a little bit about what type of catfish anglers we have in the state of Nebraska. And so I went through all those surveys and pulled out any of the responses that came from people that indicated they spent at least one of their trips throughout the year fishing for catfish. So not necessarily catfish preferred anglers, but people that spent some time on the water chasing them. And pulled out all from those 3 surveys the responses and looked at a couple of different pieces of information that were continuous throughout the surveys. One, how far people traveled to the most visited water. Not necessarily for catfish, but most of their fishing occurred within what distance. How often they went fishing during the year, how many times, which is also a general measurement, not necessarily catfish specific. But we did have on all 3 surveys a question that asked people what proportion of the catfish you caught this year did you harvest. So we have a measure of observed harvest tendencies for the anglers. And then I used 2 sets of questions that were developed by Ditton in the late 90s. Most of us have seen those that look at the attitudes and motivations of anglers on the water. So all in all, there were 11 data points I took, and I jammed into a fancy machine learning technique called a K-means cluster analysis. It's been around a long time. So ran a K-means cluster on this and came out with a few different types of anglers, which led me to get to know these 3 guys a little bit more. Caleb, Ray, and Bob. Before I go any further, raise your hand if you are a catfish angler. Okay, now raise your hand, looking at those 3 pictures, if you think you'd probably like to go fishing with Caleb. Ray? Bob? Quite a bit of diversity in the room. We'll come back to that in a little while. But we're going to talk about Caleb, Ray, and Bob here today. And let's start with some of those variables that I pulled out of the data. We look how far they were willing to travel to the most visited water. This is a categorical question, so they are grouped within ranges. But Bob showed a lot more tendency to be willing to travel for fishing, a little more vested in what he was chasing and after. I'm going to be using median measurements today because most of his measures are highly skewed and they're categorical, so it's a little better central tendency measure. It's also a lot harder to bump, so when I see a difference with medians, I'm pretty confident that's a pretty serious difference between these groups. So Looking at Bob, he jumped up one category from his two compatriots there and was willing to travel about 30 minutes in Nebraska to fish compared to the other two. And the differences kind of start getting greater from there. When we start looking at how frequent those three guys were taken to the water, Ray was the most infrequent visitor to the water. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because median value for Ray was still 20 trips a year. Now, I love fishing. I have a family that loves fishing, and I'd say 20 trips a year is probably taxing me quite a bit. So when you start looking up at Caleb, who's taking 35 trips a year, that's a serious amount of time on the water for some of these guys. And Bob kind of falls somewhere there in the middle at 29. Talking about Catfish Harvest, these three guys differ a little bit too. Bob is the fishmonger of the group. Obviously, he's a lot more willing to harvest fish when he has the opportunity. Sometimes everything they catch, sometimes just a few of them. Caleb's the other end of that stick. Half the time, he's more willing to take nothing at all versus anything more than that. So I got the full spectrum when it comes to the willingness to harvest fish, but it does split out nicely between these three anglers. We're going to go to attitudes. These are questions that try to measure what's important to the angler for a successful fishing trip. What are they most interested in? How do those things rank up? And so really try to compare like angler to like angler and how that changes. The two things that stand out to me looking at what makes up successful fishing trips to these folks, for Ray, he wants to catch a fish. He doesn't want to go home skunk. He wants to get the skunk odor off, catch at least one fish while he's out there. The most important thing he has going for him on these four items. Caleb, on the other hand, is the only one of these three that really places a significant amount of importance on size. So those two are going to come into play in just a minute here, but keep in mind, Ray, he's out there to catch a fish. Caleb's out there really interested in size. Bob, we're not sure what Bob's after yet. We also measure angler motivations. This is looking at things like social impact. It might be to get closer to people and friends or to get away from them, either way. Be around nature, exercise, or fishery resources, which is where Dylan kind of lumped everything that had to do with fish. To eat fish, to take something home, to win a prize, catch a big fish. And across the board, all of these three anglers, that fishery resource component is always at the low end of the stick, and this is consistent throughout the literature. But much more so for Caleb. Those other factors were much more important to Caleb being on the water, and the fishery component, once again, this is the guy that was interested in fish size, really fell away. So he was out there for other reasons. So those are the questions that I actually used through that cluster analysis, but there's a lot more information in that survey that I could take a look at to see how else these three guys differ. Let's go back here a second. Demographics obviously are one thing to consider. If you look at those three anglers, there's not a lot of variation in gender. There's not a lot of variation in ethnicity, and they pretty closely match our licensed anglers of the Nebraska. So not a lot of difference in those demographics, but this is the one that really stands out as being different among those three guys. Ray's the old farmer. He's at the upper end of the scale. Tends to be quite a bit older than the other two groups. Caleb and Bob, while similar, Caleb's trending a little bit more on the younger end. So we're talking younger for Caleb, older for Ray. And we also asked them to specify for us what they prefer to fish for when they're on the water. So once again, I used results from anyone that targeted catfish at some point, but we asked, do you actually prefer to fish for catfish? And Bob tends to be the angler that would spend most of his time chasing catfish compared to his two counterparts, with Caleb being a little lower on that scale. A few other things. Using streams and rivers in the state. Nebraska, for those of you that aren't familiar with our state, streams and rivers are largely private, almost entirely private. So without some kind of access that you have connections with, you're not going to get on those waters. And they're also pretty secluded, more natural maybe than a lot of our reservoir and lake systems. And Ray tends to be the angler that favors those systems the most. And so it's not really much of a surprise too that Ray's also the most likely angler to use private waters. Tends to like to get away from everybody else and be in a more secluded, more natural environment compared to Bob and Caleb, who have a much higher likelihood of using our state park system. Places that have more amenities involved, restrooms, ramps, parking lots, trails, playgrounds, soccer fields, more people around, more of a social environment at them, and also includes a lot of our larger systems in the state, our large reservoirs. So you start to see some differences here where Ray tends to want to be away from people and not, or improvements to the systems, where Caleb and Bob are a little more comfortable being in those environments, chasing those fish, maybe being there for other reasons, family reunions, gatherings, soccer games, and fishing along the way. Bob tends to be the guy most interested in fishing out of a boat, or at least having access to a boat. Keep in mind, Bob was also one of these three anglers that tended to travel farther, so demonstrating a little more investment in gear and in technology and the money he's willing to put into the endeavor. Ray, bottom of the three. And as you could probably guess at this point, Caleb and Bob were the two more likely to participate in fishing tournaments in the state, leaving Ray out there on a bucket by a stream by himself. And I'm not really sure why I threw this in there, but we also asked how many of these folks got checked by conservation officers, and surprisingly, the guy that harvests the most fish tends to get checked the most by our conservation officers. The guy that fishes private land gets checked the least. So not really much of a surprise there, but it's always kind of nice to be able to see that stuff showing up the way we think it would. So get back to these three anglers. Obviously, there's a pretty different profile for each one of these guys. How many people, if I was to ask you now, would change your mind who they want to fish with? Anybody? Kind of figured. Caleb fishes more often than the rest, so a little more avid angler. Caleb is what I would call the opportunistic experience angler. Doesn't necessarily set out seeking catfish, but willing to go after them when the opportunity exists. Likes those larger fish for that experience. Size, greater the numbers, but is actually less motivated by fish than some of the other components that go into those fishing experiences. Ray, on the other hand, has the age distribution of the three groups I was able to come up with. Really interested in making sure he just catches something when he's out there. Lowest use of parks and boats, but highest use of streams and private waters. And I kind of refer to Ray more as that stereotypical lawn chair angler, the guy that likes to get away from people, sit down and just fish. Bob is who I would say is the most engaged catfish angler of the three. The first point here is wrong. He actually fished the middle amount, but tends to drive farther, use boats, more interested in harvest, which might drive some of that driving further and purchasing more equipment. Every bit as interested in numbers of fish as he is in size of fish, and now also the most catfish preferred of the bunch. So three very different types of anglers. And one of the things I've always liked about segmentation as a biologist is it allows us to see how big these groups are. And in Nebraska, we have a lot of waters in close proximity to each other. We have a lot of opportunity to maybe provide diversity of opportunities. So it's nice to know how these groups stack up against each other. Overall, in the data set, they were pretty even. Ray represented about 37% of the entire sample, with Caleb and Bob about 32% apiece. But when we break that down by individual surveys, you can start to see there's some differences. So I know we started this morning before lunch looking spatially at segregation of our anglers. I'm going temporal. If you really look through time, we start to see a trend. We start to see that Ray and Bob are continually moving downhill. In the 20 years that Catfish Symposium has been going on, we're seeing a decrease in their makeup in our Nebraska angling population. Caleb's on the rise. In fact, if you look at 2002 at the time, Caleb represented only half of either Bob or Ray's numbers, where now it's greater than either one of them. So the landscape at this point in Nebraska appears to be changing. We're seeing a different type of angler start to grab hold. Now, that doesn't mean that Ray and Bob are important to us, that we don't need to meet their needs as well, but Caleb kind of starts to represent the angler I don't think we've served very well in the past, so it would probably behoove us moving forward to continue to look at our angling demographics in Nebraska, because they're not static. They are changing, and if we want to maintain the happiness of those anglers, which right now ranks pretty high on every survey we do, we're going to need to maybe introduce some new goals and objectives along the way. So thank you for your attention and your time today. I hope you guys have a great symposium.
Several questions.
Susan.
On your previous slide there,
Yep.
you showed the trend of the Caleb type of angler.
Yep.
Are those trends significant? Did you do a statistic?
I haven't looked at statistically yet, but my gut feeling is yes, because the magnitude switch is pretty low.
Yeah, I would say probably Caleb.
Caleb in particular.
Visual inspection. Caleb is probably a separate group, and the other two are probably.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
So there's quite a bit of overlap in some of the clusters, so sometimes it depends on your thought process at the time, but it's without a doubt anything I've seen, any way I've looked at this data, Caleb's on the rise.
So how do we measure for the Calebs, or how do we manage for the Calebs?
Well, to date, a lot of catfish management in our state has been oriented primarily at harvest. We want to make sure we provide harvest opportunities for anglers, even though we have a lot of lakes in close proximity to each other. We are working to try and provide more management opportunities for more quality fish, more memorable fish, a little bit larger size structure, more catch and release type of situations. They like the experience. They're out there for the experience they can have, the opportunities that exist. An opportunity that we've had in the past with some feeder lakes that were instituted for other reasons, but started to grow great catfish populations in small sandpit lakes. And those became extremely popular with the type of angler I would say Caleb represents. And so those are the type of opportunities I think that would probably appeal to that group, and we may need to look at doing more of.
Yeah, I'll kind of piggyback on what Susan was saying. So if the numbers are actually increasing and significantly so, then wouldn't you say maybe we are managing appropriately for Caleb?
Build it and they will come. And we had this conversation right before lunch too. Are they fishing that because it's available? Would there be more that would want it if it does exist?
Maybe we're managing for Caleb right now, but even know.
Possible, but given the strategies we have and the creel data we look at, I would wager we could probably do better.